is a National Historic District. It was designated back in the early 70s as such by virtue of the fact that we are a National Historic District. It's required that we have a system in place to do preservation, design review on historic buildings. As people are interested in seeing towns as a reflection of what their history is, grounds people and the citizens here in history so they know their roots here and what those are. The history of Crested Butte is that it was a coal town. So it was not a very wealthy place originally. Most of the residences were probably 500 to 1,000 square feet, very simple vernacular frame buildings, as opposed to places like Aspen and Telluride, which were gold and silver towns, much more elaborate, larger buildings made out of masonry and stone. This was a working man's town. And I think it's important to reflect that history today. Very few masonry buildings. The masonry buildings that exist, like the Old Rock School behind me, are public buildings. There's probably really only 3 stone buildings in town. This one, the jail, which was rock for obvious reasons, and then across the street on 2nd Street there is a stone building that was an ice house, and it was a practical reason. For practical reasons, that was stone as well, to so that the ice would last longer into the summer. But by and large, if you look historically at the photos and the buildings in town, they're all very simple frame buildings. It's the original building type were log buildings, and that was because they didn't have a sawmill yet. Once sawmills came in, the stick frame building came into vogue in these places. So typically a lot of the really older residences in particular are log buildings. Again, if you look at the facades on Elk Avenue, for instance, what they tried to emulate were materials that were perhaps of a richer type. For instance, if you look at the Old Town Hall, if you look at Stefanik's, or what's now called McGill's, even the wood that is on the front is made to look like stone. People generally put most of their effort into the street frontage of buildings and less effort into the rear of buildings. So it was all about putting your best foot forward, and that's where they spent most of the effort. You know, Crested Butte also has a rich history of outbuildings. I think Crested Butte was actually one of the first in Colorado historic districts to actually value the outbuildings and to put in a regime to save those outbuildings and the history that they represent. But the outbuildings in town are certainly tell part of the history of the town.
When I first drove down Elk Avenue, it was the only paved street in town, and there were kids and dogs playing in the street. You had to take your time going down the main street of town so you didn't hit any kids or dogs. Remodeling here was, you didn't know what you were going to find. It was all pretty primitively built. Rock foundations instead of concrete foundations, just stacked rocks, if there was any foundation. And old hand-hewn timbers, newspapers stuffed in walls for insulation. they'd have a house that probably wasn't 1,000 square feet and they could raise 8 or 10 kids in it. In March of 1990, the original Crested Butte State Bank was blown up by an explosion in the crawl space of propane gas that had leaked from the underground pipe system that they had in town. It was basically leveled to the ground except for the vault, which was still standing. And actually the president of the bank was hanging by his foot from the vault right after the explosion. The challenges related to building here, and the codes require that you can't really build unless you dig a deep basement. You can't be below frost line, which is a standard in most places, but here frost line can be as deep as 8 feet. Have even more insulation because of the extreme cold, and you have to design your building for heavy roof loads because of the snow.
In the past, buildings were made of full dimension lumber, which meant that the trees were harvested, lumber was sawn, a lot of it down here at the end of elk. A 2x4 was a true 2 inches by 4 inches. A lot of natural materials were used. Rock was also harvested from the end of elk, where the sawmill actually stands. Other materials were used, such as leather, wool, cloth. A lot of the insulation was newspapers, so you can imagine how cold it must have been for the old-timers and the folks who used to live here 100 years ago. Around the 1950s and 1960s, sheetrock, pre-hung doors, and compartmentalization of rooms was a major change in the way that buildings were constructed. Behind me here is the old town hall, and that's where the original hose cart was housed, and it's made solely out of wood, as opposed to this building standing behind you is a mixture of brick and wood. There's some other examples along Elk Avenue of different types of construction, false facades on the front of buildings to give them the appearance of a larger building behind. So it's interesting that a lot of the firefighting techniques was dynamite. You needed to create a fire break to save buildings that were not affected. As I referred to this building behind us, the Old Town Hall, they had set a charge adjacent to it, and they used too much dynamite, and it blew out windows and blew up buildings 2 or 3 blocks away. So it's interesting that they often had to destroy buildings to save the ones that were not involved. And consequently, some of the subsequent buildings were constructed from materials of buildings that had been destroyed. So you can see old fire burns and patterns of construction from a hodgepodge of buildings as the new buildings were constructed. It's kind of interesting. 100, 125 years ago, buildings were built out of available materials here, and the most abundant material was lumber, or wood, of course. Major difference between Crested Butte as a coal mining town and, say, Aspen, which had a lot of silver and gold mines, was that the buildings in Aspen were built with a lot more brick, stone, and expensive materials. A lot of the lumber that was harvested around here was sawn at the end of Elk Avenue in the Bob Rosman's, what is now Bob Rosman's sawmill. And that's located where they harvested, actually, a lot of stone for 3 of the major buildings in town here, most notably the Old Rock Schoolhouse, and then behind me there's 2 other stone buildings, the jailhouse and the ice house behind this building over here. Other than that, most of the lumber was full dimensional lumber, which meant that a 2x4 was a true 2 inch by 4 inch in diameter. And buildings were framed up in what they call a balloon frame construction, which meant that a two-story building had studs that went all the way from the sole plate all the way up to the top plate, and then the sides were covered in planks. Inside, the structures were covered with predominantly a lath and plaster construction where slats, 1-inch wide slats, were nailed onto the wall and then plaster was covered over top of that. Sometimes they'd use chicken wire over top of the lath strips, and you can see some examples of that down at the current town hall, which used to be our school. Roofs were constructed of rafters, so some heavy beams and rafters were set on top of the roofs and then covered with purloins and either shake shingles or tin, corrugated steel, whatever was available. A lot of the older construction used natural materials such as wood, cloth, leather, wool for the building construction, and there wasn't a whole lot of insulation. Sometimes people would use newspapers to insulate, and I'm sure it was very, very cold. So the newer construction, you have fiberglass bat insulation, blown in cellulose insulation, etc. Also in more modern times and current times, we have a lot of petroleum-based products. So furniture is made out of styrofoam, not styrofoam, but polyethylene and polystyrene and other petroleum-based products. Buildings tend to burn a lot hotter and a lot faster. As far as building construction, we've moved into an era of lightweight building materials. Roofs now have engineered truss systems that are made at factories and then shipped to the site. Floor beams are what they call TJ&I, and they're manufactured or engineered truss systems as opposed to full dimensional lumber and larger dimensional lumber, as in the older construction. A room can actually go to flashover where everything in the room burns from ceiling to floor in less than 4 minutes now because of the lighter weight construction.
The Old Rock Schoolhouse is a perfect example. When I first moved here, and for many, many years after I moved here, it was pretty run down, abandoned. It was used as storage. The school district owned it at that time. And the bell tower had actually been struck by lightning, so it was actually tilted for many, many years. There was actually a fire up in that bell tower. And then at one point in time, a group of people decided that they wanted to refurbish, rehabilitate the building, and hired a couple of local architects. Actually, I don't think we were hired, I think it was gratis work, and a group of builders. And we went in there and did some repair work, straightened the bell tower out. And, you know, that project has gone through several renovations to the fine little library that you see today. But it had gone through a lot of evolutions in its to get to its final state. But that's a good project. You know, that's a building that is definitely worth keeping, putting time and energy into it. Then there's historic work, a lot of residential, old miners' cabins that have been real run down, many of them throughout. Annie Perko's house is a perfect example. We got into that about 4 years ago with new owners and discovered that Annie Perko's house not only was moved to that location from another location in town, but it's actually 3 buildings blended, joined together at the hip to create the single residence that we all saw for many years. So the new owners out of Texas put a lot of money into that, and I think that house has kept its charm. New plumbing, new electrics, straightening up the swayback roof framing. The thing that really intrigues me the most out of all the years that I've worked on these old buildings in town is how lightly built, how lightly structured they were. And yet some of them are 125 years old. And they have seen snowfalls during that decade plus that we can only dream about, and yet they're still standing. It's just pretty amazing how those old timers put things together. It was mostly just hand tools. They didn't have cranes, they didn't have power tools. They cut two angles, 90-degree angle and a 45-degree angle. That's why most everything is a 12-12 pitch. Two angles, that's it. They built these buildings with just the tools that they could carry around. They didn't even use tool belts. So it was pretty basic construction. But, you know, their product too, the designs that we inherited from them, the pioneers, were very organic. They were building buildings in the style and the techniques that they knew and they brought to this country from the old country, wherever that is, Croatia, Yugoslavia, Italy, whatever. But Crested Butte has a little flavor from all those basic communities, those basic towns in Europe. And the pioneers brought those techniques with them. But they didn't, a lot of times, didn't use plans. They didn't have design guidelines. They did everything just by memory and by common sense. They needed a 3, 4, 5-room house. They just built a 3, 4, 5-room house. It needs to be about this big, and let's go get the lumber. A lot of times they milled the lumber themselves or just got it from the local mill and just put it together. And they look like what they look like. You know, that was their style. So we have guidelines on historic buildings, how to work on historic buildings. A lot of those guidelines, rules, and regulations are come from the state of Colorado, Historic Society. So there's been a lot of homework done through the years. And I think out of a lot of the communities throughout the state and throughout the country, Crested Butte is really kind of a shining star. It's kind of an example of how it can be done, but it sure takes a lot of energy, a lot of committed people to get to the point where we're at today.
And I got to credit Molly Miniman too for helping to maintain this character in this town. That's what everybody loves. When they come to this 4-way stop, they look at this and say, man, I would love to live here. I wish I could make a living here. I mean, this is where I want to be. And there's good reason for it, because it's been maintained. You know, it's kept the character that drew you here in 1978, drew me here in 1978. It's one of those things that has been maintained just basically because of some tough design guidelines. It used to be clad in all that yellow clapboard, and underneath that you have stone, and then you have log, chink, and plank. And you go, wow, that's interesting. And then you go over to maroon, and first in maroon, and I found Johnny Biggers did the remodel over there. When we took that board and batten off that house, we found log right in the middle of town. And a lot of these homes came from Gothic, made their way down here, and they were log homes up in Gothic and Irwin. They'd roll them down here and place them in various spots throughout town. The town was pretty small, so they were closer to downtown. I would think you could sled them down in the winter, or you could roll them down in the summer. So they're typically rolling down, but even at Gothic you had to go up before you came down. A lot of these that you find right in the core on the west side of town came from Irwin. Came down the road, came down Kebra Pass, basically, and placed right in position. And the core is what draws people to this area.
In 1998 and 1999, the town endeavored to study all of the historic buildings because it was requested by the State Historic Society. We have had this beautiful historic district since 1974, but we really didn't know much about our buildings. So this map represents two things. All of the buildings in red have some connection to historic lineage. And this line around this green area is the historic core that the town has, the town council over the years has established as being higher level of review and care taken for the buildings to be preserved if they're historic, although additions can occur, or new construction, which is called infill, has a relationship to the historic forms. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is a map of the town of Crested Butte, and I just want to give you a reference. I am in the old high school built in 1927 right here. Everything is really almost west. This is 5th Street right here. Here's the highway coming in. You're turning onto Elk Avenue, and west of 6th Street is between the streets of Gothic Avenue and all the way to White Rock, really from 6th and 5th all the way up past 1st Street. This is the historic core zone. It has several different zones that are involved. Elk Avenue is the B1 district, and that's where the intense business and commercial district is. And on either sides is the B3 zones and B4, and that means that those are mixed zones. They used to be all residential, and now businesses have developed into these areas. The really great thing about Crested Butte is that it is a working men's town. And in our 1998 survey, that was really well established. That's pretty unique. So many times we want to remember how unique Crested Butte's sense of place is and its sense of scale. That sense of scale is 1, 2, and 2.5 story buildings. Some of them go up to around 35, almost 40 feet, such as Achievers, but for the most part, 35 feet is the height. That's a human scale. We can feel like we're connected to the buildings. We don't have to look up too far. So we get to have this sense that around us are buildings that we physically relate to, mentally relate to. We're fortunate in that. As town changes, we're finding that most of the buildings were sloped roof. That's so the snow could come off the roofs. We get quite a bit of snow in Crested Butte. And it was also a style that came from different areas. Sloped roof buildings are pretty prevalent. It isn't until into the 1970s and 80s we start seeing the flat roof buildings. Flat roof buildings are necessary. Snow shed and taking people out or side yards out is not a very good idea. So we have to get into building codes where flat roof buildings on Elk Avenue are basically required so that there isn't problems with the snow. Right here is Elk Mountain Lodge, where many people are aware. And this area right here was called Newtown, that was developed in around 1923 and 4 by the big mine. This is where the gym is. This is where that feeling is. This is where that sense of community and character is. It is wonderful to be here, and we don't always understand it. Is it the built environment established by the buildings that were constructed in the 1880s and 90s and up until the 1940s? Is it because we have lineage and a connection, roots to a coal mining community that had a lot of heart? They worked really hard. They worked harder than we even know how to work, but they also played hard. They got together for venues and have polkas. They had potlucks. Certain ethnic groups were supportive of each other. We are the beneficiaries of these people that laid down so much before us, and we don't always realize that. I think some of that energy is embodied in the buildings that we are still trying so hard to preserve and so much enjoy. We have a need, intrinsic need to feel like we've come from someplace. And many times we hold on to our past so that we can feel this connection from the origination of a community like Crested Butte. Where were the origination of most of the buildings? Where did it start? In the historic business district. If there wasn't a sense of commerce, Crested Butte wouldn't be here. Yes, there was a mine and a number of mines around Crested Butte. The big mine located in this area, south of Crested Butte, up on Gibson's Ridge, was really the premier mine that brought people here, that brought miners here and their families. The future of Crested Butte really rests with the people that are still working with the built environment as well as the successors. It is not an easy task to maintain or to decide to have building forms that are of a particular genre and a particular architectural style when somebody is designing their own home or their own building. It takes a special group of people who come here and understand that stewarding, being stewards, which many of the Crested Butteians are, is as much importance as the Bozar, as the town council, as the town government who are trying to steer in the town in itself, who are trying to convey this importance. The stewards are those people who have come before us, who are here, and who are succeeding us. And that's what's really important. That is the future of Crested Butte. And to keep and retain this magic that happens here with the built environment, the people that are here, the incredible involved the arts, and also many of the museum, so many of the nonprofits. All of those are integrated, so intricately woven. As we understand this is a special place, we have to work as a group to maintain or to keep this place as special as it is when we found it. Here we are at Town Hall, which used to be the old high school, and you can see right here is an historic building plaque. If you're walking around town, you'll see some on the buildings, and they're part of the historic buildings walking tour, and you can get those walking tours at the museum. About 33 plaques that were developed in around 2010, and more will be developed in the future. But it gives you a little bit of history about each building and sometimes a little bit of anecdotal information. If you look at the Somrak Plaza, there's a plaque on the building that was owned by the Somraks. And Francis Somrak gives us just a little bit of hint as to how special Crested Butte was.
Well, interestingly, when I came to Crested Butte, I had no intention of staying. I was here for a summer vacation. A good friend of mine had told me to come out and enjoy Crested Butte, and I would surely get a job and make things work. By the end of that summer, I decided to put off returning to write my thesis for my master's degree, and I started building a log cabin for myself. During the summer, I had worked as a waiter at Penelope's and had done some laboring for a couple of construction projects and became sort of intrigued with the building process. So I thought maybe I'll postpone that master's thesis and build myself a cabin and move on from there. That cabin turned into a 5,000 square foot house, which caused Bozar to revise all of its rules and regulations, and so had a benefit to the community that was unintended, but nevertheless substantial. There are so many projects I've been involved in, I can't even recall them all. Some of the ones in town have been the renovation of the old town hall. That was an interesting project. We pulled the building off of its rubble foundation. Poured a new foundation, which was a challenge because the old building was not square in any way. It was a very apprehensive time, whether or not when we reset the building, would it fit the foundation. Fortunately, it did. The building was located along Coal Creek. Coal Creek floods in the springtime. And so we consulted with a water engineer as to how high the foundation should be. And we talked to 2 or 3 of them. None of them would give us a straight answer. So I looked up Lyle McNeil, an old-timer who was a builder and a former mayor of Crested Butte. I asked him what was the highest he'd ever seen Coal Creek run, and then we built the foundation wall 2 feet higher than that. Renovated what is the old rock schoolhouse, which is currently the library. That was an interesting project because the building was essentially falling down. We really rebuilt it entirely except retaining the shell. A particular challenge that I can recall vividly is taking the bell tower off of its perch, resetting it on the roof, rebuilding the perch, and resetting the bell without the use of any heavy equipment, because at that time heavy equipment was hard to get in Crested Butte. One of the big differences between building now and building when I first started back in the 70s is there really wasn't any heavy equipment around. There were front loaders and backhoes, but there weren't any cranes. There weren't any excavators, and to bring those things in was very expensive. Most of them probably would have been brought in from Grand Junction. So, for example, when we poured foundations, we didn't have any cranes to move the concrete chute around with. In many cases, we would have to move the concrete by hand in wheelbarrows. In the old days, when we were about to set a ridge beam, we didn't have a crane, so we would go around town toward the end of the day, invite any friends that we could find to come over, buy a case of beer, with manpower set that ridge beam, and then have a big party afterwards to celebrate our accomplishment. Very much like a barn raising. Building has changed quite a bit since then. There are better techniques, better products, and of course accessibility to heavy machinery, and that makes things a lot easier. And the truth is, right now, these days, last 20 or so years, the buildings we build are much more complicated than the buildings we built 30 and 40 years ago, which generally tended to be simple homes and simple office buildings. Well, what I foresee for the future is currently you can buy prefabricated homes, but they have to be simple in design. I think, like so many other professions and occupations in this country, that the computer is going to make it possible to pre-build houses in a factory rather than at the job site. And that, particularly in Crested Butte, is going to be quite an advancement, because building here is really very sensitive to the weather. We have long, very cold winters. Certainly in the old days, the winters were longer and colder, but there's still a substantial barrier to efficient building in the modern era. So I think there's going to be a change in the industry, that prefab homes will become increasingly the way to do it. And to some extent, that's going to put certain occupations out of work here. And like other industries, people will have to change and find different ways to make a living. As we all know, it's a challenge to make a living in Crested Butte. It was 40 years ago, and it still is these days. It was much more interesting to build something that was different than that particular style. We have a strong architectural review process here, but what they have done is designated different areas that they hold accountable to that style. So the downtown, for example, of course, is always going to be Mountain Victorian, but some of the outlying neighborhoods, they've given them more leeway, and I honestly think that that's a very good idea. So we're seeing different architectural styles in some parts of town, and in those areas where it's important, of course, we're still building Mountain Victorian.
Very good. Very good. Would you like to add anything more?
Well, I remember that I started out building log homes, and we thought that that was the way to go. This was in the early 70s. It was kind of the hippie counterculture was the backbone of the population here. And working with your hands and getting back to earth was a sentiment that people were taking up. And of course, building with logs lent itself to that sort of philosophy, because you could go out and cut your own logs, you could set your own logs, and you could live with a very basic structure, and that was in keeping with what the attitudes were at the time. Log building started to fall out of popularity because really, although wood is a good insulator, logs themselves are only can provide so much, and we have materials and techniques now that vastly increase your insulating properties. So building a home with logs, if it's done now, is usually built around a framework of partition framing, so that you can provide the insulation that otherwise you would be missing. And I would say the logs are still popular. I would say particularly with our clientele from Texas and Oklahoma. But people have moved on to modern architectural styles, and we see all kinds of different things now. And I'm glad to see it. Logs, Mountain Victorian, got to be old for me after a while, and it was exciting to build modern structures, not here in town, but elsewhere up on the mountain down in CB South. Well, stucco was a material that even the old-timers used. There weren't too many buildings that were stucco, but because there was a historic precedent, Bozar would allow stucco as an exterior finish. Stucco is great because it has long-wearing properties. Materials are changing, and a lot of homes are going back to wood because they're using synthetic composition facsimiles of wood that have the appearance of wood and yet have the longevity of stucco, and possibly or even a better product. Getting back to logs, at the beginning there was some difficulty with Bozar building logs because actually there were only a few log structures in town. I remember an incident in particular when Hank Barlow tried to bring in the Molensic barn down from the ski area because they were getting rid of it. When he got to town, the mayor at the time, Bill Crank, told him, "You can't bring that into town, it hasn't been approved. You're going to have to go through the process." So he parked it outside of the town boundaries. Subsequently, it was difficult, but he got it approved. And in this day and age, they use that Molensic barn as an example of how you should build in the town of Crested Butte if you're going to use logs. Anyway, it's the second building from the corner. The old Bosquet building's at the corner of 2nd and Elk, and there's a new building which where they run the they had the Bacchanal restaurant there for a while, and so it's wedged in between those two buildings. It's interesting because there's still space on that lot. Anyone building a commercial building today would build to the maximum allowed, In those days, nobody cared about that, and they built just what they had and what they needed.
It was a small little rundown town, like you might expect, close to becoming a ghost town. Few buildings, a lot fewer than there are today. And they were all in quite ragged condition in those days. Not many people were living here, probably, oh, I don't know, 300 people or so. And I think the dog population rivaled that. Prior to 1981, when I became involved with the Wooden Nickel, it had been owned by several people, probably from the time I moved here in 71 and the time I took it over in 81. There were no less than 4 different owners in that period of time. So the Wooden Nickel name was given to it in I think in 1970 or 71. Prior to that, it was referred to as Tony's Tavern. When my 2 partners and I came to Crested Butte, that's Lynn Heiche and a fellow by the name of Jim Kuziak, we came out here from New York and saw what was here. We recognized that these old buildings represented a certain time in history. We were familiar, coming from New York, we were familiar with the Brooklyn Heights Historic District, and we saw what was able to be done there in a preservation effort. And we thought that something like that would be, not only would it be preserving the heritage and the past here in Crested Butte, but it would also add to an economic value of the community by having some sort of controls, if you will, on what would be built, what would be fixed up, and what would be maintained in the town of Crested Butte. So it was at that time, probably in the early 70s, that we promoted the idea of having an architectural control board here in Crested Butte. And over the years, it's evolved. I think it's done what it was set up to do. It's preserved all the historic buildings that were here. What we found when we moved here is all the old timers, which represented a large part of the population. They just thought these are old buildings and should be torn down. And when we put forth the idea of preserving them, they really didn't understand it. But I think as time went by and these buildings were fixed up and renovated, I think they, took some pride in the history of their own town, and that sort of just spread throughout. So I think over the years, Bozar has accomplished the goal of preserving that heritage for the old timers and the newcomers alike. And that character has continued to be maintained through the outlying parts of Crested Butte, the areas that weren't built on in the 70s. Until 1962, when the Crested Butte ski area was started, and a whole different element and type of person started coming through here. It was an adjustment for a lot of the old timers, but I think they enjoyed the youth coming back to town and seeing a revival here. As they saw these old buildings being preserved, I think it took them back in time as well. There are many buildings that were here when I moved here that did not survive the opportunity to be renovated, and they're gone. But some of the ones that did survive are, of course, the old Croatian Hall, which is now owned by the 11 folks up at Irwin, Slogar Bar, Penelope's for one, Kachivers had been reworked. Trying to think what other ones have been salvaged. Unfortunately, the Salt Lick on the corner was demolished, and there was a building up on the corner where a Third Bowl is, which was just hanging on when I moved here. Major loss to the center of town was Frank and Gal's, which is a wonderful, wonderful building, a bar, and the old timers alike. It was many evenings on the weekends, and at other times, holidays, there was always a great polka band going on there. Unfortunately, in 1974, actually I think it was Friday the 13th, it burned. It was a major loss to the town, and today it's been replaced by the the Eldo Cafe, and the post office sits on the original spot. Also, when I came here, there was the old company gas station, which was on the corner of 3rd and Elk, where Peter's Restaurant is now. We happen to be involved in building that corner up in 1975 and 1976. So there's been a lot of changes, but it's all because of the Bozar and the historical concerns. Uh, we've had we've had a lot of additions and a lot of property saved. Also, I think what we tried to do too is brighten the town up a little bit. You know, it was a coal mining town, a lot of ashes, a lot of cinders, a lot of smoke. So I think dressing these buildings up in a variety of colors to brighten things up was always was something that turned out to be a lot of fun to do. And I think that whole trend has continued on. And the buildings, I think, look very proud the way they are and all dressed in their colors. You know, Crested Butte has come a long way. I mean, from a town of about 300 people in '71 when I moved here, it's approached 1,500 probably within the town limits. One of the great saving features of Crested Butte and what's going to allow it to survive and maintain its identity is it's basically landlocked. Its growth opportunities are pretty well shut off. We have national forest to one side, we have wetlands to another side, we have land owned by the town on a fourth side, and we have a 35-acre subdivision, Trappers Crossing, on the other. So town is pretty well defined at this point in time. There still remain a few lots that could be built out and will be. But I think the overall character of Crested Butte is going to remain. I think Bozar, I think the intention has been fairly well fulfilled. The only drawback to the whole system of Bozar, I think, is it's somewhat subjective. It was impossible to objectify what it was that what you wanted to see. So as the complexion of the membership of Bozar continues to change, you get different ideas of the individual's perception of what should have been done or what was that period. And maybe that variety is good and maybe it's not, but I think that's one of the shortcomings that Bozar's had over the years, is the constant change in the membership and the lack of a real defined, if you will, outline of what the building should and shouldn't be. But the new sections of town, there's been a little bit more leniency of what's been built. As you might see on the eastern side of town, for example, when I moved here, east of the highway, there was basically the old railroad depot, and that was about it. But it's now completely filled in with some beautiful looking homes that have been built over the years. But I think it's done a good job, and Crested Butte will be here for years to come, I believe. Well, here's another little interesting point, is that Crested Butte didn't have any street lights back in I'm trying to think, probably back in the 70s. And then the town council, our town planner, I believe it was Miles Radaman at the time, found an article in a public publication that the city of Miles City, Montana, had some street lights that they wanted to get rid of, and so a contingent from Crested Butte went up to Miles City and bought, or were given, about a dozen or 18, dozen and a half street lamps, which are really an addition to Elk Avenue. Shortly after that, I was visiting family in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area, driving through Burbank, California, and went past a public works yard. And there in the yard were stacked, I don't know, 100 or 150 old lampposts from Burbank. When I came back from that visit, I instructed our town planner, Miles Radaman, again, to contact the people in Burbank to see what they were doing with those streetlights. And coincidentally, they said, if you want them, you can have them. So that was the beginning of an interesting process to accumulate and bring those lampposts here to Crested Butte. There was a rancher here who happened to be hauling hay to California, and he was coming back empty. He was deadheading back, and we were able to work a pretty favorable deal to have him haul them back. So after several trips, we had all these streetlights in Burbank. Our local Rural Electric Association was kind enough to install all of them and wire them at their cost. And we now have, I don't know how many streetlights we have in town. Actually, we had an excess of them. We sold some to a few other towns, one of which was Redstone. And the money we got from those helped defray some of the cost of hauling those streetlights from California. So when you look around town, I think at the four-way you'll see a little plaque on one of the lampposts thanking Burbank for their contribution. I think Crested Butte has been a wonderful place to raise a family, to live. It's definitely a lot better than what New York City would have been. Our kids look back at it now in their youth and say they wouldn't have traded it for anything. So I think it's been a great life here in Crested Butte and look forward to many, many more years.